Hello and welcome to this session on statistical process control. In this module, we will look specifically at control chart for continuous data. There will be a separate module to look at the charts for discrete data. In this one, we will look at the individual and moving range chart and the Xbar and R or S chart in Minitab. If you use JUMP or other statistical package, the principle will apply, but obviously the instructions, the dedicated menu will be slightly different. The PowerPoint is really going to only serve as a backup to make sure you have some of the key concepts I'm describing in writing so that if you want to, you can refer back to them and giving you that point of reference. But practically what the session is really about is focusing on the how to create those charts by making sure you select the right chart, setting up the data correctly so you have minimal rework, then how to run in Minitab for the purpose you want and how you want it to look out, and then analyzing the output. So let's recap quickly on how to select the right chart. As I said, discrete data is out of scope of this one, so we won't go in this branch. And today we'll be focusing on continuous data, which may include things like time, money, weight, mass, volume, length, temperature, and all sorts of measurement that is very, very common in industry today. The key point is you need to make sure you measure that there is a unit and that your range of values show there is a continuum of possible value that would come up through the process. Now, obviously, as is iterated in the session that talked about the key principle, depending on whether you're collecting individual data point or reporting the average of a sample will dictate which graph you use. So in particular, in the case of individual and moving range, it's very straightforward. If you are producing 10 items in 10 days and 1 item per day, for example, then you're going to plot 1 item weight each day. If you're measuring a duration, it's the same thing. It took 10 days and I'm measuring from the point the person checked in the room. That's what I will measure. If, on the other hand, you have quite a transactional process, which have high volume, you may need to group things. So you might choose to do it group by day, very, very common, or you may choose to take a sample within a day and then take the measurement of that sample. So if that's the case, you're going to be using the Xbar chart. The next question you probably will ask yourself is, do I use the range or do I use the standard deviation? And that really comes down to the number of data points in your subgroup size. Whether your sample size is constant or not, fundamentally is what is the typical value in that sample size. So if your volume is fairly low, less than 7, definitely use the Xbar and R. Between 7 and 10, you have a little bit of flexibility, but I would probably say initially use the Xbar and R. If you have more than 10 data points within your sample, then you're completely entitled to use the Xbar and S because that will use the standard deviation to assess the stability of the variation in the process, and that will probably give you better insights into how your process is performing. Now, as I said, if you're between the 7 and 10, this is where there's a bit of gray area. I would probably encourage you to run both charts and see which one gives you the most insight. That's the great thing nowadays with Minitab or other packages. It takes seconds to run the chart. The hard part is actually collecting the data. So just a quick reminder here. Again, I know I detailed these points in the theory and concept, but they're really important. And if you haven't seen that video, then I just want to make sure you're aware of them. Your data point need to be independent. So if you have some form of artificial bias or grouping that is happening, because you may have a customer who puts in 3 orders because they've got a special deal. Or in a service world, for example, in insurance, we sometimes have people who put multiple claims because they have multiple health issue and they're told to put 1 claim per health issue. Reality is obviously that is going to create a form of bias in your data. So you need to understand the process to detect if this is the sort of things that happen, and does it happen as a matter of course, at which point, well, that will probably be dealt with the volume. But if it's only occasional, then you need to identify the bias element and try to remove it from your data collection. So we can talk more about this when we talk about data collection and subgrouping and sampling, because those are key concepts, but I just wanted to remind you that point. Also, please bear in mind that these original control charts were based for data that has a process which will create a normal distribution. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect. If it's the empirical normal distribution, it will be good enough and you can use it as is. If you have a process who by nature is not normally distributed and will never be normally distributed, please use caution when analyzing the outcome, because again, it's a key fundamental assumption behind those rules. So in particular, if you have a process like call waiting or call handling, which all have very long tail on one side, you can imagine that some of the rules associated with being on either side of the center line are going to be affected by this. So again, it's if you know your process, it'll be obvious, and I will trust you to not misunderstand your control chart. However, if you share it with somebody else, you might need to add that layer of analysis to make sure they come to the same conclusion as you do. And finally, obviously, historically, we would recommend people to have 10 to 13 data points so that the rules kicks in correctly. Because as you can see here, some of those rules nowadays go as high as requesting 14 or 15 data point to be used correctly. So obviously, if you have a fairly new data collection and you don't have the 15 data point, you can go in the test and amend these numbers. We wouldn't typically recommend it. What will happen, I would suggest, is that you let the process run. And when you have enough data point, those tests will kick in de facto. So just use this with caution. Depending on the version of Minitab you have, you may have a version where instead of having k point in a row out on the same side of center limit, you may have the 9 already being coded, or a slightly different value. You may have it as 6, for example. So that's just version issues. Okay, so with that, just one more theory point, if I may be so bold, before we kick in and look at actual data in Excel and Minitab. Just some reminders, especially since there's a lot of this which is automated these days. Obviously, you might be working with huge data extract coming from data warehouses or queries through BI and others. And that's fine, and that's great, and it's brilliant. You just need to still know your data, making sure that it represents a process. That if there are errors in the input, because ultimately those still happens, or there's errors in the processing, heaven forbid, you can identify those and hopefully deal with them before you generate those charts, especially if those charts are going to be populated in a report that go to senior stakeholders. Okay, so check your data, especially if this is the first time you create a chart before it gets automated, but continue monitoring it even after. Make sure your data is chronologically organized. If you leave the data in there, don't assume that Minitab is going to automatically detect, oh, this is the date field, because at least you pointed that out. I'm going to sort the data so it makes sense. It's not that smart yet, okay? So this is why I will tell you, make sure you keep your date of data collection so that then you can sort it chronologically. If you have subgrouping, you will need an additional layer, which is probably something like an observation ID or whatever referencing you have for each data point, so that when you need to sort your data, you can use the date of data collection and then maybe that reference number if it has some value, okay? But please, please, please go and check your data before you start graphing and analyzing it. So if you are using an individual and moving range chart, for example, this is as simple as your data need to be. You will have one column with the dates in chronological order, and one column with the metric that you are using to assess your process performance. Please make sure that the unit makes sense for you, because obviously, if you need something which has decimal point and you're only providing integer, it's not going to give you that granularity. Okay, I cannot make it up for you. On the other hand, if you have an Xbar chart type that you're trying to produce, your data will look like a little different in the sense that you probably need at least 3 columns so that you can easily refer the data. Obviously, the date, and again, the actual data measured, but also, as I said, this observation ID. Now, this is a stacked format. Minitab is capable of dealing with unstacked data, but there is some limitation. So either way, please make sure that you're clear about how you're subgrouping your data. In my example, it's going to be by date because that's the most common, but it might be different. Okay, just make sure you're clear and that you can pinpoint it in the data and that you can trust it. If you chose some form of description, make sure there's no typo in the description, because if there is a typo, every time it's going to come across a different spelling, it's going to count it as a new sample. So obviously it will break your data and certainly the analysis. As with any other element, make sure again that you do as much of the processing with the raw data prior to doing it in Minitab to make it easier, because most source files are better handled that way. Okay, just a quick recap. These are the steps that I will be showing you today and how to perform them in Minitab. The slide is just there as a reference, and we'll walk through this now. So let's jump to an Excel file that I prepared earlier today. And we'll start with the ImR chart. So as you see here, I've got my dates, I've got my timing. This is for a loan or mortgage application. I'm assessing how long it takes to make the decision and back to the customer. And you may have situations where you're evaluating how the process is performing over different phases. So if that's the case, we'll show you how you do that. And there's 2 ways to do it. One that include the recalculation and one that doesn't. So this is what this column here will be for. And just for information, notice that the break in a phase happens on data point 11, which obviously is on row 12 in Excel. So if you have a small amount of data, obviously it's very simple. You can just straight copy paste it into your Minitab worksheet. Because I selected the header, obviously I'm going to put my cursor directly in the header in Minitab and click paste, and it's ready for them to use. I'm just going to quickly check the count of data. If you have a lot of data and you don't want to go to the last row, you can obviously go into your window and check the project manager, and looking at worksheet 1, it will give you your count of data to make sure that you have all the data you expected and how it's been identified. So my data being here, I can now go into the stat, control chart, variable chart for individual, and you have a choice. You could do just the individual, which will show you how the data plots over time and the average of this data. Or if you're also interested in assessing how much variation there is in the process, then select the ImR chart. We'll give you both. As always, double click to get your field to come through. In the scale option, select stamp, put your cursor in the field, and then the column with the data will show up. So in my case, it's date. And let's say I want to see if something happened on that 11th week, to see if there's a change in the process. I don't want to force a recalculation of limit yet, so I just want to position this reference line so I don't have to do it manually in PowerPoint later on. So as I said, I remembered it was data point 11, so I'm going to put it here. And because I'm interested with time, I put it in time scale. You might be in a situation where you need it with regards to adding a reference line to superimpose your customer CTQ, for example, which in my case is actually 8 days. But so I'll show you both, and we'll see how that looks. And then click OK. And then the most important step is to go on your ImR option button. You click under test, and make sure you select all test. Okay, especially if you know you have enough data points. If obviously you want it to be a bit more selective because you know you don't have enough data point, you could select just the one you're interested in. But typically, I would encourage you to perform all tests. And then we're just going to click OK at this point and see what my chart looks like. And here we go. So at the top here, I've got my individual chart, which has the center line in green, the actual data in blue, and the control upper and lower control limit in red. This horizontal dotted line, as I said, is that 8. It shows a bit small. Let me increase that. Is the value of 8, which actually is my customer spec limit, which I choose to show here, just so that people could understand how close or how far we are from reaching those specs. At the moment, we're not doing so well because the average, and this is a mean, is 14.4, right? So we're quite a way away, and there's not been a given day in those 20 days of data collection where we were near reaching that 8-day limit. And then as far as did anything happen after the 23rd of January, you can see now the line has been added. And really, nothing has changed. The variation is pretty random. At least that's one good thing. The process is stable. And this is another thing that you have to remember. The analysis of a chart is completely dependent on the process you apply it to. If I didn't tell you that my customer spec limit is 8, and I would like my application load time to be below that, you wouldn't know whether this is good or bad. So everything has to be given context so that your audience arrive at the same conclusion as you do as quickly as possible, right? Now, obviously, this may or may not be relevant. So if you want to decide, okay, I'm not going to show this value yet because it's not fun, just click Control-E to rerun, go to the scale, go to reference line, and we're going to remove those. And we're going to click OK, and then rerun it. And there you go. You have now this original chart nice and clean. Now, if you wanted to force a recalculation according to those phases, the way you would do it, so again, I'm going to go Control-E to go faster, is you go into your ImR options, and you're going to click on stages, put your cursor here, and obviously I call them phases. And notice you have an option that says with each new value. So this is why it's so important that when you name your phase, you make sure you have no typos in there, because if there is an S instead of a Z or Z instead of an S or an extra S somewhere, it will count this as a new value and give you a new phase, and obviously your graph won't work. Now, when like me, you only have 20 data points, it's not too bad. You can go back and fix it quickly. If you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of rows, it's no fun. So that's my point around make sure your data is clean. So we're going to click OK and OK. And now you see my graph has been split. I've got nice headers to identify which phase we're talking about. We can put them in the context of actual days in the year, so people can understand what may have happened around the 27th of January, if they know. Maybe we're short on people, and suddenly, considering the volume of application, we just everything took longer. I don't know. And that's the whole point. When you start to see interesting things, the first thing is check your data, and the second, investigate. In this case, the conclusion is my process is stable. If you're in your measure analyze phase, this is great news because you can go ahead and analyze it. If this was at the end of improve, beginning of control, you've done your first trials, and you were hoping to see some improvement, well, it's not so good of a picture, isn't it? So this is what I'm saying. The analysis of a control chart is very much in the context of the process and of your implementation changes. Okay, hope that makes sense. Always play back if you need, or if you have additional question, you can always put them in the comments. So now let's have a look at the Xbar charts. So I'll go back to Excel. I had prepared one earlier, as you can imagine. So as you see here now, it's the same period. I'm still going to go to the bottom to show you. It's the same 20-day of data collection, but I've now shown here the actual application lead time for the decision for each and every individual application during those 20 days. And I'm going to group them by day, because at this point, I know so little about the process. I don't know if I should be subgrouping by anything else. So obviously, because different days have different volume of application, my sample size, I'm not quite sure what it is. So I don't know whether I should use the Xbar now or the Xbarness. The simplest way to do this, in my opinion, everybody has their own view, would be to run a simple pivot table. So select your data, click Insert Pivot Table. I'm going to keep it in this sheet to keep things simple for you. So put the date as the row. Unfortunately, with the new version, it will offer months. I'm not interested in month here. And then I'm going to add the lead time, and I'm going to ask for a count. So we're going to go in value field, and you ask for count. And then this will give me how many applications were recorded each day. And you can see here, I have quite a range, right? I've got 496 data points. That's great. If you want, I'm going to fix this to avoid having an issue, but you can also check what's your mean, max, and the median of that sample size. Okay, so my minimum is 6, my maximum is 63, and the median is typically 14. So this is where, when you look at the range, you have only very few cases where we were below 10, and actually most of them is around that 7 to 10. So this is a good example where, honestly, I would run both the Xbar and the Xbarness and see what is the most useful. Okay, now I've got my data, I've got an understanding of my sample size, I'm clear with my subgrouping. So I'm going to paste this. Remember, this is the stacked format into Minitab. Put it here, and I'm going to go into stat, control chart for subgroup. And as I say, I'm going to try both to see what comes up. So I'm going to start with the Xbar. Now, because my data is stacked, this is where all the observation are in one column. So that's my setup now. So I'm just going to point the data. The subgroup size will be defined effectively by looking at the date field. Having said that, obviously this is for subgrouping. I still need to include it for the x-axis so that it stamps things nicely. And I'm going to go in the Xbar and R option button to then make sure it selects all the tests. And click OK. And OK. And it produces this graph. So because I selected all tests, you'll notice that we have 2 data points that came out breaking rule 1, which is more than 3 standard deviation from the center line. We have some that broke rule number 5 and some that broke rule number 6. So if you don't remember what these rules are, the good news is you can always go back to your session window, and Minitab will very kindly provide you with which rules, the actual rule itself, and which point. So you can very easily appreciate, okay, what may be possibly going wrong. Now, it doesn't necessarily do it in chronological order, hence why it's really useful to appreciate the data point that it provides. Because, for example, here we had on data point 4, we were 2 standard deviation away from centerline. 6 and 7, we were 1 standard deviation from centerline. So they're starting to get things that are going kind of out of whack. And then eventually at 10, we went a full 3 standard deviation away from the center line. So from that standpoint, this is where when you put things together, you realize, yes, I could have potentially start investigating things here before it broke there. Now, obviously, it's interesting to notice that these were going in the right direction. This is going in the wrong direction. So as I said, it's not always, you cannot read a cookbook and know how to analyze a control chart. This is why I said you have to look at it in the context of your process. Now, just as a quick reminder, obviously we can again our center line here, which is the average of average, hence why there's Xbar bar. And then we have our broken, so to speak, upper and control lower limit on the basis that we have different sample size. Remember that in Xbar in our chart, the bigger the sample size, the tighter the control limit, the wider the control limit, the smaller the sample size. Okay, so it's kind of a reverse logic, but it all makes sense because obviously this is based on the confidence that it has, and the confidence is in proportion with how big your sample is. So when you are very confident, because you have lots of data point, your control limit are going to be quite tight. When you have fewer data point, obviously you have not as good of a confidence, so your control limit are going to be wider. So at the top here, if we just look at the average, clearly our process is not stable. Is it out of control? I personally don't like that terminology, but I appreciate it's the one that you will see in books and what have you. The reality, what to me looks apparent, is we seem to have a bit of a cyclicality developing. And that's to me what I would go and investigate. Okay, if we look here at the range, however, is very stable. And this is why, for me, even though this looks unstable, because this is stable, to me, it screams cyclicality. But that's something I've learned, obviously, over years. So this is where it's good to look at both. But please be aware that they're complementary. They're not in conflict. They each tell you something different. So this is where you have to use the information widely. Very nicely here, notice that Minitab has pointed out that you have sample size of samples of unequal size. So it's also obviously explained the broken line. So I mentioned that obviously if you have your data stacked, it's the way of presented. What would happen if your data is unstacked? And there's actually almost two formats of unstacking. One is this format where on the top row, you may have the dates, and then underneath for each date, the individual lead time of how long each application took to get a decision for. So N represent effectively the order of the data point in this case. Alternatively, and this is becoming more and more common with applications like Power BI, Tableau, and R, and many others, whereby for a row of data represent a date. So your first column effectively represent the date or the subscript, if we want to use the Minitab language. And then all the subsequent columns hold each of the individual application lead time. And again, you will recognize how I've used a bit of an indexing to make this work. So let's have a look what happened when we try to use this in Minitab to see how it works with unstacked data. So this is another reason why having those indexes is quite handy, is because then when you do the copy paste again, it'll be quite straightforward. So I'll just bring Minitab over again. Right, I'm going to put it here. So I've got my dates and they recognize the date, and then I've got my various data point. Notice that when there's no data, Minitab has put the little asterisks. So I go in stat, control chart. I definitely want a subgroup. I'm going to use the Xbar net because in this case, I've got a wide range of sample size. And this time I'm going to select one row of column. I put the cursor, select all the columns. So this is where if you click on the first one, you use the elevator to go all the way at the bottom, press shift, and then the last one and click select, it'll go a lot faster. And then go on scale, as I would have said, and try to put the date. But as it is, Minitab is already telling you it has a bit of a problem, is that your columns are different length. So it's effectively telling you your sample size are not equal. I'm going to have an issue in this format. So to demonstrate, obviously, this, I would need to cut a lot of the data, which I've prepared before, to show you how it works. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to delete this particular worksheet. go back to my Excel file. And having prepared this one before, I'm going to repeat the exercise to demonstrate. I just wanted to show you the error message so that if you were to get it, you could progress through it, hopefully without too much havoc. So put the data in now and go back into my control chart subgroup. Now I'm only have 6 data points, so I'm going to use the Xbar and R because that's appropriate. I'm in one row. And I'm going to scale, and you'll see that it allows me now to progress to the next stage, which is always encouraging. Connect the date, go to the options, select all test, and click OK. And OK. And here's the chart. So it's a beautiful chart. My problem is, and I'm sure you will have the same thing, is it's a fraction of my sample size. And therefore, it probably doesn't give me a fair representation, because how can I be confident that having only 6 data points per day is going to be a good representation of my process? So the reality is, when you have unstacked data and you have unequal sample size, you need to transpose this data so that it can deal with it and then stack it. That would be my best recommendation. So there are a number of ways you can do this. You can go it through Minitab to, I would recommend first do the stacking and then transpose. If you do it in Excel, you actually have to do it the other way around. So I'll show you how I do it in Excel, because you might be in the same situation and it's a bit of a funny one. So you would select your existing data. Let's say it's like this. Control C, I'm going to create a new worksheet. Right click, and then you're going to go into Paste Special, transpose all of it. And now you're going to have it this way. And then from this format, you can paste this into Minitab and ask Minitab to stack it for you. So through the data, stack columns, you're going to ask to select all these columns. I'm going to ask for a new worksheet. It's going to use the variable name, i.e. the title of each column, to give me the date. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to click OK. And now I will have this worksheet. So I'm going to change subscript to date. This is going to be my lead time. Remember, I would recommend that, especially when you have continuous data, to include the unit. And now I have stacked data that I can happily use a control chart subgroup with the S. And it's going to work. There you go. Now, this is what happens, obviously, if you don't go and select the stamp option, as it will just use a random index. This is where it's good to go through the option to stamping and indicate the date. So I hope this is useful. Obviously, we've already analyzed this, so I'm not going to go through it again. Just be aware, obviously, that if you had already had your data stacked in this format and put it in Minitab, it would have made no difference. It would have the same problem. It would tell you that it doesn't deal well with sample size of unequal sample size. And if you truncate the same thing and you put only 6, what it will do is it will create a control chart with only 6 data points, which is obviously not what we want. So this is why it's really important to understand, again, the layout of your data and how it translates into Minitab so that you get the most out of it. Okay, I hope this is useful. Let's go back quickly now to the deck so we can recap. So obviously, as I mentioned, when you look at your graph, you need to analyze them in the context of your process. In this example, clearly it was stable, which is a good thing if you're in measure and analyze, maybe not so good if you're in control. And so if there was outliers, like there was in this case, the most important things is go investigate. Check first that's not the data, that there's a glitch in it, and then go and speak with the team to understand what happened and what caused this extra point, which was the one we're barely interested in understanding because it was a negative experience for the customer. And actually, that brings me to a point where this also is a great opportunity. Since you're going to go and investigate root causes, you should probably be able to go back to the customers that were the most affected. And it might be appropriate, obviously, to be discussed with the process owner, to put in some form of containment action or contingency action so that you can mitigate the likely negative experience that the customer did face so that you don't lose a future customer. Okay, so control chart can be good for a lot of things, but obviously they need to have the follow-up behind them. And this is why in SPC, we have control chart, but we also have the control plan, and the two go hand in hand. Okay, so obviously I describe a lot around these particular odd patterns in the theory or key principle module. I am not going to go through them again. Just wanted to put them in here in case it would be a handy guide as you analyze your own process. Again, the run and the trends are fairly straightforward. Cyclicality, you will get used to it and ultimately make the right judgment call with your process owner as to what is the right frequency to display in your chart, depending on what you want to use the chart for. If you have a process which has a process Monday to Friday and a different process Saturday to Sunday, trying to bring the whole week as a daily report may not be giving the best picture because effectively you're combining two things that shouldn't be combined. It's not going to show up as a hugging or mixture. It's going to show up as cyclicality. So is it a case where you decide, you know what, I'm just going to do a reporting on a weekly basis? And there might be some report for which it's completely appropriate and useful. But then if you're trying to give a report for the team, it may not be as relevant for them because they're not going to see the environment they work in. So this is where I say you need to work with your process owner and a team to make sure that the control chart is relevant and value add. Okay, with that in mind, I will stop here. If you want more information, there's a wealth of information, obviously, within Minitab that you can access either within the application itself or online on their website at support.minitab.com. I will be posting more materials, obviously, if you like those. And in particular, if you need the equivalent information for discrete type data, then obviously there's a companion. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe and drop me a note in a comment about the sort of topic that you'll be interested in.